Hey guys, and welcome back to Squares and Circles, the podcast where we transform growing pains into life gains. I'm your host Ellie, and I'm so excited to have you join us on this journey. Here at Squares and Circles, we dive deep into the challenges and complexities of transitioning from teenagehood to adulthood. Whether you're 16 or 60, navigating major life transitions, or just seeking a little guidance on your path, you're in the right place. From self-care and mental health to career development and personal growth, we cover it all. Today, we're tackling the topic of slumps. What they are, why we fall into them, and most importantly, how we can pull ourselves out. It's something I think we can all relate to. I'm so excited to be joined by Claire Knight of Wheel of Life Coaching, who specialises in helping people break through when they feel stuck. In this episode, Claire shares powerful insights, practical tools, and expert advice to help you regain motivation, overcome self-doubt, and confidently move forward. By the end of this conversation, you'll have the knowledge and the confidence to break free from any slump and continue thriving on your journey to reach your highest potential. So get ready to level up with us. Let's turn those growing pains into life gains, laugh through the struggles, and embrace this wild journey together. Let's dive in and grow through this together. Hi, it's me from the future. Not really, I'm just here editing the podcast, and I just wanted to put a little warning in because I know it's a podcast and everything is meant to be like all about the audio, bleh, but I'm here to warn you, the audio sounds bloody shit in this episode because we just got new equipment and we clearly didn't know how to use it yet. Don't worry, we've learned now, so it's not going to sound so bad in the future, I hope. But just want to give you a little quick warning about that. Please can we forget and ignore that it sounds a bit rubbish and move on. Alright? Sounds good. Now, enjoy the episode. Love you. Hi Claire.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. I'm good, thank you. Would you like to start with a little introduction? So tell us a bit about yourself, about Wheel of Life Coaching and your background and just what you're all about, really.
Yeah, I'm Claire Knight. I'm an emotional wellbeing coach and mindfulness teacher, and I help people who are at a point in their life where they feel stuck, perhaps navigating a difficult life chapter. I help them get to a place where they feel empowered, where they have tools to regulate themselves emotionally, and where they can tap into their inner resources so that they can navigate that difficult chapter that they're going through.
What inspired you to start Wheel of Life Coaching?
Well, I had some coaching. When was it now? It was in my 30s and 40s actually, and I had some counselling for a spell, which I did find useful, but I was quite blown away by coaching. It just used different tools, it was very insightful, and it kind of tapped me into a kind of more wise version of me.
Yeah, that sounds so nice.
Yeah, it was great. I was really impressed with it, and I thought about just doing a taster course. So I did a taster course in coaching, and I really enjoyed it. The course covered NLP, which is really helpful.
What's NLP?
It stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming.
Okay.
So it's a bunch of techniques and tools that help you access kind of what's going on under the surface and help you retrain your brain.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. What sort of techniques? Just like a little example.
Sure. So it might be something like having a timeline of your life and walking forward on that timeline to a place where you feel like you've put whatever challenge is going on in the past.
Okay.
So you're jumping forward to a time when you feel like it's water under the bridge, you've dealt with it, and then as a coach I would be asking you, how did you get there? What did you do? What did you have to believe?
Yeah.
What skills did you use? So it really puts you in a place of, yeah, I've conquered that, I've done that.
So it's sort of a bit like, have you heard of visualization, the manifestation technique that people do? So it's sort of a bit similar to that then?
It is. Visualization is a big part of it.
Yeah.
And one of the tools in NLP is mental rehearsal, which is where you visualize yourself doing something that's difficult. And I always give the example of Johnny Wilkinson, the guy who was the kicker for England, and he always had a little anchor where he used to put his fingers together, and he had mentally rehearsed that over and over, and by putting his fingers together he was re-triggering that in his mind so that he could zone out the whole crowd and do his best kicks. So that's so
interesting.
like an NLP technique.
Yeah, I've not heard of that before. That's really interesting. So how does your coaching philosophy help people navigate challenging slump-like periods of time?
Well, I think the coaching philosophy is around nobody is broken. That's the first thing. We all have access to the resources that we need to get through life. The coaching philosophy is really about empowering people. So helping them access their own wisdom, their own insights. And of course, we need that when we're facing a slump.
Yeah, of course.
You know?
I like that. I like what you said about nobody being too broken, because I feel like a lot of times people kind of think, well, I'm beyond help, so I'll just carry on as I am, going through like my shitty period of time. But that's very true. Nobody's too broken to be fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a way forward. And I guess part of my philosophy is around how we can either connect with fear, and fear can play havoc with our mind and our thoughts, or we can learn to notice when fear crops up and try and just observe those fearful thoughts.
Yeah.
So a lot of mind management helps you to navigate those periods more successfully.
Okay, so let's start with the basics then. What exactly is a slump, and why might somebody find themselves in one?
So the way I would define a slump is a period of low motivation, low energy, and probably low mood. And just a feeling of, it could be restlessness, hopelessness, but just feeling really demotivated and a bit stuck.
Definitely felt that before. I'm sure we all have.
I think we have, yeah.
Yeah. So what might lead somebody to be in a slump?
I think there are lots of causes.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've got the kind of obvious causes like events that happen in your life that you have no control over. So it might be things like losses, bereavement, that kind of thing. It could be life transitions, as you talk about in your podcast, Ellie, going into a different chapter where you perhaps feel overwhelmed.
Yeah,
and it's
definitely.
Yeah.
I know the feeling of that one.
Yeah, and it's new territory, and you're having to grow parts of yourself that you hadn't before.
It's like exercising new muscles. It's always way more painful than exercising ones that you've already exercised before.
Absolutely. And some of those transitions really challenge us in that respect. Stress is a big one. As we all know, if we have too much going on, we start to feel out of balance, and that can result in a slump. But there's even things like seasonal changes can have an impact, SAD, any events beyond our control.
It's coming up, isn't it?
It is, the darker nights are coming. If we've got a lot of trauma in our background, and it hasn't been properly processed, then that can cause us to go into a slump. And I should say that slumps obviously vary in their intensity.
Yeah, of course.
And if people are feeling a really bad slump where they've lost their appetite, they're having problems sleeping, they're feeling very depressed, then they should get professional help and they should go to their GP.
Yeah, 100%.
But, it can be that we're just not stimulated enough as well. That can be another cause. If we don't have that variety, that stimulus, then we can just feel apathetic and bored.
I think I've also definitely experienced that. So I've found personally during my transition to adulthood that I've been sort of in and out of slumps constantly, and like you said, they've varied in intensity depending on what the cause of them was. So I know I'm not the only person who's experienced this. So the big question is, does the constant in and out of slumps and then feeling good and then feeling bad again, does it ever end?
Good question. Well, I think there'll always be things that happen in life that challenge us.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong journey, isn't it, of learning, of growing, and challenges. However, I think as you grow, as you face more slumps, then you do develop, insights, wisdom, hopefully, which helps you recognise when a slump's coming on. And also, I think you get to know yourself better. So when a slump comes up, you know what triggers it, and hopefully you have some strategies for managing those slumps.
Yeah.
But they are kind of part of the human condition. And I think they vary depending on what's going on and the intensity of, some of the challenges that are happening. I think you do kind of get to a place where you feel a bit more comfortable with them.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
So it's more about learning how to manage them rather than learning how to not fall into them. Almost.
Yeah. I think you can try and proactively manage not having a slump. So there's things like self-care. But I think when they do come along, you can't necessarily run from them. That resistance sometimes leads to other problems. So people try and numb out a bit if they're having a slump. I think you can learn to just manage them better. And obviously it depends on what you learn, what you research, the help you get, that type of thing.
And also I suppose how you navigate your own slumps over time. Is a huge factor as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so if you kind of ignore them and just think, oh, I'll get out of it, you're probably going to end up repeating that cycle. Whereas if you're like, right, I need to learn how I can manage this type of stress, then when that stress comes up again, you're probably more likely to be like, well, I did it last time, so I'll do it the same way this time because that worked. That will make it feel a bit easier rather than just not dealing with it properly and then being like, oh, well, here we go again.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's the word that's coming up for me is being conscious.
Yeah.
Being conscious during your slumps.
I think that's very important rather than just trying to shut it out. So I think a lot of people like to, especially when they're feeling negative emotions, I think a lot of people like to ignore it and just focus on other things and distract themselves rather than going into the darkness and thinking, how do I get out of this? Rather than how do I just survive this?
Yeah, I think you made a really good point. So there's things called FABs, favourite avoidance behaviours.
Got a few of those.
Yeah, me too. And that's where we kind of try and escape. But if we lean into a slump, there's often a lot of learning that we can get out of it. And just being present, knowing that everything's changing all the time anyway, and it will pass in time. But just leaning into it and being curious about what's going on and what's causing the feelings that you're having.
So why do you think it's so common for people to experience these slumps? Because I can't think of a single person that I know that hasn't experienced one.
Because I think that our minds, they have quite a negative bias. You know, it's estimated 60,000 thoughts a day.
That's a lot of thoughts.
It's quite exhausting. And if we start to have a lot of negative automatic thoughts, they can just circulate in our heads, and then of course thoughts cause feelings, and we get into that place where we feel stuck. And I also think that stress causes us to go into that place of a stress response where we're either kind of hyper aroused, where we're agitated, we're anxious, it's fight or flight, or we're in that hypoarousal where we're numbing out and feel frozen and stuck. So the stress response is a normal thing, and it's, there is a lot of stress in life generally. Yeah. So it's about how we manage those triggers to a great degree, as much as we can.
Yeah, obviously it's not all within our control. Like if something big has happened, you can't really do anything about it. You've just kind of got to...
Hence the slump.
Yeah. So I know we've kind of spoken about it a little bit already, but what are some of the psychological or emotional triggers that can lead to a slump? And is there any common patterns that you've noticed that lead people to the slumps within your clients?
Yeah, well, I think stress is a big psychological trigger. I think often what I've noticed is that perfectionism can be a big one. If we have a harsh inner critic who tells us that we always have to do better, that we're not doing good enough, that we aren't good enough, that's probably the most common limiting belief that human beings have, is that we're not good enough, then that will cause a feeling of overwhelm often, and a feeling of, well, I can't even try because if I do, I'll fail. And also not recognising our own worth as a person, perhaps not valuing ourselves in relationships, in terms of our boundaries with other people, and maybe not honouring our values. So the values are the principles that guide our lives and that we hold dear to us as an individual. And everybody has slightly different values. But if we're not honouring those values, then we're out of alignment.
Yeah.
And that can feel like we're just not on the right track. And we can experience a slump as well.
I can imagine. I know a lot of people that have felt like that way. I've felt that way a lot before. Yeah. So I can imagine it's quite easy to fall into that sort of thing, especially in this day and age with social media. I think stress, well, it's been shown in studies that mental health and stress has shot up a lot since social media has been a thing. Well, either that, or of course there's like the whole thing of like maybe it wasn't diagnosed properly, or there's lots of like factors that go into it, but essentially it has skyrocketed. So I think social media definitely has a big part to play. What do you think about that?
You get comparatinitis, as I like to call it, and it's kind of comparing people's outsides with how you're feeling on the inside.
Yeah.
So, you think of Instagram, all the influencers who seem like they've got it all together.
Yeah.
And
you forget that they're just posting their highlights, though. They're not posting all of the rubbish that they're going through as well, are they?
Absolutely. And I think that can be a major source of stress.
Yeah. I think it's quite an incognito mode of stress as well, because people don't quite realise. I didn't realise how stressed social media was making me. I took a month off in January. That whole month I was just so happy. I was just like, life is actually really good.
Yeah.
I'm actually pretty cool as a person.
Yeah.
But it's because I didn't have the ability to compare myself because I wasn't on social media. Well, that was the only thing that had changed, so it must be that. So I think we don't even realise a lot of the time that social media does affect how we feel about ourselves and about our lives and about what we're doing, because we're so in it and it's so ingrained and so part of our lives. We can't imagine a life without it, which I think it is quite hard to do anyway, because it's important. Like, a lot of people's lives are on social media now, and if they're not, then they want to stay connected with, loved ones and stuff that live far away. So I think, social media definitely has a big part to play, and a bigger part than a lot of us realise.
Yes, because it is linked to all the neurotransmitters in your brain in terms of dopamine, and getting that like triggers dopamine, which in turn makes us feel good. And of course it can work the other way as well. And keyboard warriors out there, haven't you? Who will, say pretty awful things. But it is insidious, and it is a part of our lives that we're having to navigate, that perhaps, like you say, Ellie, wasn't around in the past. And it's a difficult balance, because you want to kind of stay connected and in touch. You want to see what your family in Australia is doing, in my case. But at times it can really take over. And I've experienced that too. So it's about how you manage that. And there are some apps out there that act as kind of gateways to stop you, or to get you to be more conscious about going on social media. Yeah,
I've seen those. There's that one, it takes a picture of you every time you try and open, I think you can set it to whatever app you want. And there's timer apps as well. I have a timer on my phone that I can only go on Instagram for an hour a day. I mean, to be fair, a lot of the time I turn it off till the next day, but it keeps me aware and it keeps me conscious. Just I've been on Instagram for an hour today. Okay.
Absolutely.
I need to, maybe I should consider going on TikTok instead. No, I am joking. Slumps can be particularly challenging when someone is trying to establish themselves in a career or manage personal responsibilities. How can we recognise when a slump is affecting our professional or our personal life?
I think it shows up in a feeling of being demotivated, lacking in energy and enthusiasm. Sometimes it can show up in terms of how we feel in our bodies, everything feels heavy and we feel like we're wading through treacle and we don't have much va-va-voom, I suppose.
Yeah.
And, in terms of work, we might be just not performing very well. There might be things that we're just not getting done, which we should be getting done. And it might be affecting our relationship. But I think your body will tell you, and just your general mood and your energy.
I think that's kind of a problem, though, these days, is that a lot of people don't realise if they're in slumps, because I think a lot of people are quite disconnected from their bodies. They might feel a bit rubbish, but then they'll just be like, I just always feel like this. But you don't have to always feel like that. I think it's quite normalised to feel tired and to feel overworked and to feel lethargic. Especially, I don't know why I have this picture of the corporate world where everyone is just with a coffee, just bags under their eyes, looking really tired. Obviously, it's not just true for the corporate world, it's true for any industry. But I think it's quite common for people to not recognise that they do feel like that. What do you think people can do to make them aware that they might feel rubbish or that they could feel better?
I think mindfulness is a really good way of connecting with your body, because you're effectively sitting with yourself and you're observing what's going on, what emotions you're having, how you're feeling. So it's a good route to becoming more connected with yourself. And I think that if people generally feel lethargic and tired, having some time to disconnect from TV, from social media, etc., and just being with themselves again, to just be more observant of what's going on for them, rather than always being busy, because I guess that is one of the escape routes, is to always be busy, always to have a busy calendar, to always be doing something socially, etc. And by doing that, we're numbing out. So it's having that quiet time where you get to reflect and to just be, because we're always busy doing rather than just being, and we need to be.
Yeah, I think that is so true and so important. And I think it's so underrated in life in general. I think not many people realize the importance of mindfulness and how even just like practicing being present every day, even just for 5 minutes. I try and do a 5-minute meditation a day.
Yeah,
that's enough. And people often think, like, well, I don't have 5 minutes. It's just like, well, what do you do for the first 5 minutes in the morning? Most people probably scroll on their phones. Don't get me wrong, I still do that. But I try and make an active effort to replace 5 of my scrolling minutes with mindfulness instead of all just being scrolling minutes, because I don't know, I really notice a difference in my day as well when I just scroll and don't make the effort to, be with myself and figure out how I feel that day and what I might need that day. When I actually do that, I just feel lighter throughout the day, and I just feel much more assertive and with myself and just better in general. In every way, really. It does the same for a lot of people. And I've been listening to a lot of podcasts recently of successful people and people that they've just got it. They've just got their lives together. And they all say that they practice mindfulness every day. So I think, if nothing else, that is something to go by, because if the people that are happy and are successful and do have energy to do what they want and do have successful and healthy relationships, they've got it all. If they're doing their mindfulness every day, then if we want that, we should be doing that as well.
It's so helpful because it gives the brain a bit of time to relax, if you like. And there have been many, many studies done on mindfulness now. It evolved from Buddhism, I guess, originally, and those kind of Eastern philosophies. But in the 70s, it was pioneered by a guy called John Kabat-Zinn. Since that time, it's been growing in popularity, and there's been a lot of studies, and it helps with concentration, focus, managing stress, and they've done brain scans on people who meditate a lot, and there is a different response in the brain.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised though, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but it's all about not judging yourselves.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of us struggle with.
Yes.
Especially with like what we were saying about social media. All we do is judge ourselves. We want to be better. We want to be like that person on Instagram who seems like they've got it all because they don't show the parts of their day where they're crying or having a really bad time or whatever is going on. But I think we just need to be a bit kinder to ourselves, don't we?
We really do.
We wouldn't treat our friends like this, so why do we treat ourselves like this?
Well, that is a good test thought. If you're having, quite negative thoughts and berating yourself, it's a good question to ask is, would I talk to a friend like this?
Yeah, and the answer is usually no.
Yeah, exactly. and then you've got an inner bully, an inner critic. It just makes us entrenched further in a slump because we feel really rubbish.
So once in a slump, why do we find it so difficult to break free, do you think?
Well, I think it's those repeating negative thoughts, going around in our heads, and we kind of get stuck in that pattern. And it's almost like we're wearing a pair of glasses that are tinted on the dark side. So we start to see everything from that lens, from those lenses. And we have something called a reticular activating system in our brain that will gather the evidence. So we'll notice whatever's happening in our day. So say we tell ourselves, I'm going to have a really rubbish day today. Then it will make sure that it picks up on all the evidence to prove that that thought or that belief is correct. And it works both ways. So if we have a positive belief, then it will find supporting evidence for that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense actually, because that's probably got a lot to do with what I was saying about my 5 minutes of mindfulness each morning.
Yeah.
So usually my mindfulness is like a positivity meditation. So if I've done that in the morning, then my brain is wired and ready to be positive. So it's picking up on the good things that are happening. And then if something bad does happen, I'm just like, oh well.
Yeah.
Whereas if I don't do the meditation, my brain isn't wired for the positivity. So if something bad happens, I'm like, oh no, this is the worst day ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's actually really interesting. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's that part of your brain that's kind of like a radar. So if we can reframe those thoughts, and if we can start the day, like you said, with a bit of mindfulness or journaling or whatever it is, some affirmations, then we can rewire those neural pathways.
Yeah.
So they don't always go to the negative, which is the default position. And of course, neuroplasticity means that we can do that.
What's neuroplasticity?
It just means that we can change our neural pathways. Every thought, every belief, every behaviour is a neural pathway in our brain. So by practicing different beliefs, different behaviours, then we can change those negative thoughts to more positive thoughts. And the same with beliefs, which are just thoughts that we have on a regular basis. So we know we can change. We can change behaviours. People stop smoking, people do lots of different things where they change their behaviours. And some of that is neuroplasticity, where we have changed that default pathway in the brain.
What is going on in our mind that keeps us stuck?
Well, it's those pesky negative thoughts that we're having, and as we have so many of them every day, if we kind of keep on fixating on the same thoughts, we start to really believe them, and that reticular activating system is seeking out the evidence, and then that affects how we feel. So we have the feelings that correspond with the thoughts, the negative thoughts that we're having, and then of course that affects our behaviours. So our behaviours might mean that instead of going to the gym for 30 minutes, we might just stay in bed, and then we feel guilty, and then it's that whole cycle of demotivation, of feeling bad, and that cycle of shame and guilt.
Yeah, so it's sort of like that downward spiral of your inner bully kicking you further and further down.
Yeah.
And then the more that you kick yourself, the more that you kick yourself. So it's just about, I suppose, finding your inner coach and holding yourself back up and almost unbullying yourself.
Yes. And we use a technique called reframing.
Okay.
Which is when, if you find yourself having a thought a lot of the time, like I'm useless or something like that, you would ask yourself, well, is that categorically 100% true? And quite often it's not. And then it's about kind of gathering that positive evidence. Well, why isn't it? Why is it not the case that I'm not useless? Well, it's because, I did that once and I did this and I'm really good at that. And building that evidence and putting it somewhere, so maybe journaling on it and reading it regularly, helps you reframe those limiting beliefs, those negative thoughts that keep happening, because they will be on the bleak side, they'll be on the fearful side, they'll be on the harsh side, they'll be very black and white, and they don't tell the whole story, and that's the problem.
Tell the negative story that your brain is telling you to believe,
exactly,
rather than the actual full truth of it.
Yeah.
I know whenever I've been in the slump, I've always felt some sort of guilt or shame or disappointment with myself, and that often leads to, as we said, self-deprecating thoughts, or just generally beating myself up about whatever it is that I'm not doing. So how does negative self-talk contribute to this feeling of being trapped, and what are some ways that we can combat that internal dialogue?
Well, it's recognising that internal narrative has a negative bias. So it's a good thing to kind of write thoughts down, to journal out all of your thoughts. So whatever you're feeling and whatever you're telling yourself, just write them all down on a page. And I like to call the inner critic the poisonous parrot.
I love that.
Because it feels like, it's sat on your shoulder, it's not letting up, it's just spewing poisonous narrative in your head. And, you can even make a name for it, give it a name, and almost see it as a kind of a bit of a cartoon character, a little mean bully that, might be a horned devil that's on your shoulder or whatever, but give it a bit of a persona so that you can kind of shrug it off a bit more.
I love that idea, because I think by doing that, it kind of helps to separate that from you. So if you've got this little devil horned parrot that you're thinking about instead of just who you are, it kind of separates that from your sense of self. It's a bit easier to be like, oh, shut up.
Yeah.
Shut up, Percy.
Yeah.
Or whatever you call it. Rather than just being like, oh, this and that. And beating yourself up over it. I think that's a really good tool to use.
We tend to just take whatever thoughts we're thinking as read, because we're having them so often, they just become part of our narrative and we don't even realise the negative thoughts. So cultivating that awareness and giving it a kind of persona can be really helpful. So it's noticing your thoughts, noticing that part of your psyche that keeps on being critical.
Yeah.
And doing the reframe. So perhaps when you're journaling, you might write down all the negative thoughts that you're having and all the ways you're bullying yourself, punishing yourself, etc. And then you take on the persona of a kind of kind, wise friend. On the next page, you would coach yourself. You would be saying all the nice, kind things that you would be saying to a friend.
Yeah.
If your friend was saying all of this to you. And that immediately starts to shift the balance. And also look at, asking yourself, well, is that really true? Is that absolutely true that I am useless or whatever it is that I'm telling myself?
Maybe for some people it might be easier as well to, because I know there are some people that just have such negative self-views that it's kind of hard for them to even try or pretend to have positive views. So maybe for people like that, it might be easier to create another persona that's like the angel or on their shoulder. It's like the opposite of the parrot, basically. It might make it easier rather than trying to be nice to yourself. You're being nice to a nice parrot.
Absolutely. And in the type of work that I do, we often call upon different parts of our psyche to step forward, to defend, to protect, to encourage. So that might be the inner parent, if the inner child is feeling scared. The inner warrior, whatever it is, whatever comes to mind, you're absolutely right. Finding a kind of part of our psyche that feels like a persona can be really helpful to put that little devil back in its box.
Yeah, where it belongs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've briefly mentioned the importance of self-compassion during tough times. Why is it so crucial to be kind to ourselves when we're in a slump?
Because we completely deserve it, because we're worth it, and to coin the advert. And, it doesn't help us. If we are mean to ourselves, it really doesn't help it. So we need that sense of compassion, especially if we're going through a tough time, because what we don't need is the tough time plus beating ourselves up and not being compassionate, because that really makes it much worse.
Yeah, it's like you were saying, it's just the cycle of kicking yourself when you're down.
Yeah.
And then the more you beat yourself up, the worse your slump gets.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's so easy for people to be kind to themselves when things are going well, when their job is going well, when they're feeling healthy, their relationships are all going well. But I don't know why it's so hard for us to show ourselves that same compassion when things aren't so good. So why do you think it's easier for people to be kind and compassionate to themselves when things are going well?
Because I think we place our worth outside of ourselves. We look for validation. So if we've got a promotion, then that ticks the box. We're obviously a good person. Or if we're in a relationship with someone who treats us well, we're a good person. If we're earning more money, whatever it is. But actually, we're a good person regardless. But we can tend to, if things aren't going well, we turn that inwards on ourselves. And perhaps we've got limiting beliefs from childhood. Perhaps we picked up from someone that somebody made us feel like we weren't good enough. So that can compound things. I think a lot of beliefs come from childhood. We're like little sponges, aren't we? And we internalise something.
Especially as children. Oh my gosh, yeah.
So, it might just be one thing that somebody said to us. Or it might be repeated events, whatever it was. But it's easier for us to dislike ourselves than it is to blame the people around us when we're children.
Yeah.
So we take it inwards and we make it about us. Then a belief forms. And that's a big part of my work, is helping people overturn those beliefs and maybe go back at that time.
So I know that for me at least, it's really difficult to show myself compassion, and I know it's the same for a lot of us, as I said, when we're not feeling our best. So what are some practical ways that we can practice self-compassion when we feel like we're not doing enough or moving fast enough or being enough?
Should we do a little tool together?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is called a self-compassion break.
Okay.
You just stop and you put your hand on your heart. And you take a deep breath and you acknowledge your feelings. So you might be saying, I'm feeling really anxious right now. I'm feeling like I'm not good enough. I'm not doing well enough. I'm feeling really jittery, whatever it is. So you acknowledge the feelings and you say them out loud. And then you say to yourself, I know I'm not alone in this. I know that there's other human beings somewhere in the world of however many billion people there are, experiencing the same thoughts and feelings that I am. And so this is really about mindfulness. And then you ask yourself, what do I need right now? And you allow the answers to come. And it might be that you sense that you just need to be kinder to yourself. It might be that you need to go and do an activity. It might be that you need to just take a break, whatever it is. And then you resolve to give yourself what you need as much as you're able to.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think putting your hand on your heart really connects you with yourself. It's really comforting.
Touch is very comforting. There's various polyvagal exercises that you can do, like rubbing your arms gently, that just send a message to your brain that all is well.
That's lovely. I think that's really good as well, because you can sort of do that anywhere. And then obviously depending on what you need to resolve the issue. Also, I think you can always do what you need to an extent. Like obviously if you need to go to bed but you're at work, you can't really do that, but you could take 5 minutes.
You could take 5 minutes and say some really comforting things to yourself. You're okay, you're doing all right, you're going to be fine. It's that nurturing of yourself.
Yeah, sort of like almost reparenting yourself.
Reparenting, absolutely.
Yeah, and making yourself comforted and feel safe again.
Feel safe,
Yeah, I love that.
There's breath work exercises that you can do.
Yeah.
Box breathing, which is when you do breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4,
Yeah.
hold for 4. That's emotional regulation. So you're just giving yourself 5 minutes to kind of send that message to your brain. You're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is all about standing the stress response down and telling it you're okay. Just it's okay.
I think that's quite a good tool for people that don't know how to show themselves compassion, because I think it's quite fact-based. It's very much like, how do I feel? What do I need?
Yes.
Rather than, why do I feel like this? How does that person feel about me feeling like this? What does that person think? Yeah. It's very much yourself-centered, which I think is really important in being compassionate to yourself. Obviously, you need to, and getting out of a slump in general is, you need to know what's going on inside.
Yeah, you've hit on a really good point. We can get stuck in our heads thinking about the other person's reactions, what they said, what they didn't say. And of course, we can't control that. We can only control ourselves. So it just brings the focus back to ourselves.
So have you personally experienced a slump during your journey in adulthood?
Many.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think we all have. Yeah. How did you recognise it, and then what steps did you take to overcome it?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of when I was much younger and I was in my 20s. I'd come out of a relationship that I'd been in for about 7 years. And it was a very formative relationship. And of course, I wasn't a coach then, so I didn't have any of the tools. And of course, there weren't that many tools in those days because I'm quite old. But I remember, feeling quite grief-stricken and feeling that sense of being in a slump, for sure. Because I didn't have the tools, I think I just kind of muddled through. But when I actually reflect on it, I moved to London from the northeast of England not long after that, because I think being in a slump challenged me to create a new life chapter. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that everybody does this, because it is quite drastic, but it actually helped me create a new chapter. I think that every slump teaches you something.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and it's about kind of leaning into it and working out what's going on, what do I need? So that was one of my slumps, but there's been many. And nowadays, if I have a slump, I tend to use the tools that I talk about, so I tend to do a lot of mindfulness, do a lot of journaling. I'm extra kind to myself, keep quite a small inner circle.
Yeah, I think that is important as well, as being very selective about the energy you let in. Yeah. Because it's easy to get into a slump if you're surrounded by people that don't make you feel your best.
Absolutely.
Whereas if you're surrounded by people that uplift you and make you feel good about yourself and inspire you, it's harder to get into a slump, because how can you be in a slump when everyone around you is constantly lifting you up?
Yeah, it's very comforting, isn't it? And conversely, like you say, if you've got people who don't have your best interests at heart, then you don't feel emotionally safe.
Yeah. I also love that you said that you moved across the country as well, because so much change happens when you're young and when you're growing and when you're figuring out who you are, that I think taking yourself out of the place that you're comfortable with and going somewhere else, I think it's really good to get out of a slump, and also then not prevent future slumps, but stop them from being so reoccurring so often. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, if anybody listening feels like they need a change, or they feel like they're constantly in slumps and they can't get out, even though it's scary and drastic, it doesn't have to be out of the country. Just a big move somewhere that you're not familiar with is a really good thing to do. It
can be very stimulating.
Yeah.
It's very courageous. And you often find that there's that mix of fear, that mix of excitement, that mix of what if, what's going to happen? Yeah. Will I find my tribe again? That kind of feeling.
I think there's definitely those feelings, but I think also you have to kind of comfort yourself and think, well, I can always go back. Absolutely. If I hate it. Because that's what was kind of comforting me. I was like, well, if I really hate it, I can just move back to Brighton. Yeah. Everyone's still there. I can just go back and it'll be like nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
I feel like we went on a bit of a tangent there. So how did overcoming that slump contribute to your personal growth and confidence as an adult, and what lessons can our listeners take from your experience?
Well, I think the slumps propel you forward in a sense if you act on them. In that situation, I acted on my slump. Moving to London was by far one of the most exciting life chapters I've ever had. I lived on my own, so I had to kind of cultivate a sense of resilience. It taught me a lot about how to just live as a 20-something in a big city. And it just taught me that I could rely on myself. And I think you grow all these skills and parts of yourself that you didn't have before. Even just having to be responsible for yourself.
Yeah.
You know, having to do your own washing, having to manage your finances yourself.
Yeah.
They're all life skills, aren't they? And I often think actually about that spell in London and think that was a really formative chapter in my life. It really helped me discover a version of myself that I hadn't discovered before.
That's how I feel about moving here. So
Yeah.
I think I know exactly what you're talking about. So for people who realise they're in a slump, what are the first steps that they should take to climb out of it?
Express how you're feeling, whether that's journaling or talking to somebody, but name your feelings, express it all, get it all out, because when we keep it inside, it has a lot more power over us than when we start to express it and let it out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good step, because I know that anytime that I've been feeling any sort of negativity, it's not, as soon as I tell someone, I'm just like, oh, it's all right, actually.
Yeah.
It's not such a big deal.
It's not as powerful when you let it out. But
Yeah.
when you're carrying it inside you and it's not released, then that's when it has much more power over you. So I'd say that is one of the first steps. Being conscious of your thoughts, being conscious of that narrative. Get help if you need it. You know, if you need some help, get some help, whether that's a therapist, coach, seeing your GP, depending on how severe it is, or just maybe having a good friend, you know, who you can talk with. Getting help, I'd say that's one of the things that you need often. But sometimes you can manoeuvre through it by using some of the tools that we've talked about. So the mindfulness, reframing your thoughts, journaling. Sometimes it's helpful to write down what you can't control and what you can control.
Yeah.
So there will be things like where you place your focus, you know.
You can control that.
You can control that.
Yeah.
Where you, what you do in a day, you know, so you're going to do some exercise, some activity, you're going to get out in nature. You can usually control that, and your attitude. So there are always things that you can control, even though you feel like you can't. And realising that can be quite a milestone getting out of a slump.
What specific tools or techniques do you recommend for rebuilding momentum and motivation during these tough, slumpy periods?
Well, I would recommend setting small, sustainable goals. Nothing too overwhelming, nothing too big. If you're in this slump, then setting a goal that's not going to overwhelm you, but it's going to stretch you a bit. You know, whatever that goal is. So it might just be getting out the house for 10 minutes. Because sometimes we can really isolate, can't we? So I think small sustainable goals is important. Using some of the tools that we've mentioned, you know, mindfulness, journaling, recognising what you're in control of, what you're not in control of. Also recognising that motivation often comes after action, not before. So often we wait for motivation to do something. And there's a great book called Atomic Habits by James Clear.
That is on my to-read list. I've heard of that one.
And he talks about that sometimes you have to do the thing and then you get motivated because you feel good afterwards.
Yeah.
So it builds your motivation by doing the thing. And if you just do a little bit, then you're not putting that pressure on yourself to go to the gym for an hour or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah, I talk about that a lot actually on the podcast, about like small sustainable goals in any aspect of anything. I think a lot of people have the mindset of all or nothing.
Definitely.
I know I definitely did for a very long time. And it's only when I let that go that I started to actually be able to properly look after myself and give myself the things I need. Everything is now more intuitive, and it's more tuning into how you feel rather than doing what you feel like you should do.
Yeah, I'm really glad you've used that word, intuitive, because I think if we do something intuitively, then we are, as you say, really tuned in rather than just giving ourselves a heap of shoulds and doing something when we don't really feel like it.
This also applies to anything. I'm just using the gym as an example. But sometimes you're just not going to want to go. And that's also using your intuition, because you're listening to yourself. Maybe you're too tired, or maybe you're feeling really lethargic, and what you need in that moment is rest. Not doing the thing is also a good thing sometimes.
Absolutely.
Looking back now, I think that I've been in and out of slumps so much, because when I'm finally out of a slump, I feel like I have to make up for the time that I was in the slump by doing the most that I can now that I'm out of it. So I probably end up doing way too much, which leads to me being burnt out. So once somebody starts to come out of a slump, if they do this as well, which I'm sure a lot of people do to, you know, play catch up or whatever, how can they rebuild momentum without burning out?
Well, it's kind of the way you view your resources, your energy. Think of it like a bag of coins. You can spend, but you also need to put some coins back in the bag. When you're doing self-care or giving yourself breaks and listening to what you need, then you're kind of giving yourself an opportunity to replenish those coins. You're not just spending so that the bag gets empty and then you feel depleted. So you could ask yourself, well, how do I start to feel when I start to get near that point where I know I'm doing too much? So for example, if I'm doing too much, I start to struggle to get up in the morning. I might start to maybe get a little bit antsy. It's like a traffic light system, you get into that point where you really need to pull back.
I suppose it's kind of, again, the listening to yourself and listening to your needs.
Absolutely. And I think self-care is really important. One of the things I suggest is having a self-care menu where you have some things stuck on your fridge or wherever, which you have kind of a menu of, well, what are the little bite-sized bits of self-care that I could do? What are the kind of more meaty bits of self-care that I could do? And again, what are, some other little dessert type of self-care activities could I do?
Treat type ones.
Yeah, that could be anything. That could be wearing your favourite lipstick. It could be going to the gym. It could be having a nice long bath with your favourite bubble bath or whatever.
Yeah. Could also be stuff like reorganising your room.
It could be.
Stuff, decluttering your space.
It could be, because that can make us feel better, can't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's having a kind of backup plan, or a pre-prepared plan, I should say, so that you've always got an activity that you can do to manage your bag of coins.
I think that's a really good idea, because then I feel like once your coins are out, to stick with your analogy, it's harder for people to think, well, what can I do to make myself feel better? But if you've already got that list of things that will make you feel better and will keep your coins in your bag or add more coins into your bag, then you don't have to do the mental work to think, well, what can I do? Mm-hmm. How do I get more coins?
Absolutely.
You just look at your little menu and think, I'll do that one.
Yeah.
And then there you go. Bob's your uncle, you've got a coin in your bag.
Yeah.
So what are some long-term strategies for sustaining motivation and avoiding future slumps? And how can we keep our momentum going over time?
I think just knowing yourself, knowing what makes you tick, knowing your values, knowing what your needs are. So, what really makes you tick? What do you need to live a healthy life? And it could be that you look at your life. So one of the coaching tools is a wheel, and you look at your life in segments, so you say, right, out of 10, how fulfilled am I socially? How fulfilled am I in terms of self-development and learning? How fulfilled am I in my career? I think you can get this online, but you don't think too much about it. You just give a gut answer. Obviously, if you're near the 10, then that's great. But then it shows up certain areas of your life that you might have to reevaluate and dedicate some focus to and some actions to. So it kind of helps you look at your life from a holistic perspective.
Yeah.
And all the different areas, because sometimes I guess a slump can just feel like a pressure and overarching feeling. So sometimes it's good to kind of help pinpoint, what is it that's making me feel like this? And there's also kind of being aware of what you consume, as in, what media do you consume and how's that making you feel? Are you being conscious of what goes into our heads and our bodies is important.
So a huge lesson that I've learned since being an adult is that things don't get easier, you just kind of learn how to handle them. Mm-hmm. And resilience is the key to navigating ups and downs. But building resilience is a whole different and difficult process in itself, which obviously takes a lot of time. So what are some practical ways that we can start to build up resilience that will help us to bounce back from these slumps when we experience them?
By making yourself do things that stretch you a little bit, so it might not be moving 6 counties away. It might be just going to that thing that you feel a bit nervous about. It could be anything that stretches us. And then, of course, we go through it and we learn that even though we felt anxious about it, generally things were okay, because we can hypothesize about things, but actually when we do things, that's what really takes us out of our comfort zone and puts us into our resilience zone, because we're learning how to grow those tools, those parts of ourselves that we hadn't before.
I think that's a really good advice, because they always say practice makes perfect, and that is very true.
Yeah.
They're not wrong.
Absolutely. And accepting that, I see a lot of people who are hard on themselves because they're not perfect at something straight away. So, going into a new job, there's that period of 6 months where you feel all at sea because you don't know this, you don't know that acronym doesn't make any sense to you.
Yeah.
And
probably have a sense of imposter syndrome going on.
Absolutely.
I'm not good enough to be here or whatever.
Yeah, that can all happen. And it's almost like saying to yourself, right, for 6 months, you're going to feel a bit rubbish at times because you don't know what you don't know and you're brand new. And just being that coach to yourself and kind of positioning it like that from the get-go can be really helpful for just allowing yourself to go through that period where you're going to feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Knowing that you're going to feel uncomfortable and doing it anyway.
I think that's something that a lot of people find quite hard. People love to be comfortable. I think we all love to be comfortable. Even if the thing that makes you uncomfortable is just sitting with yourself and getting to know yourself and practicing having a quiet mind.
I think you're connecting with the real you, who you really are.
Yeah.
So, you've got the monkey mind that chatters away, telling you this, that and the other. But then you've got the observer of that monkey mind. You're both. But often we just listen to the monkey mind and we don't connect in here to that wisdom, that calm observer, that voice of reason.
Yeah.
Because the monkey mind gets all the airtime.
Yeah. We think our thoughts are us.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, rather than them just being like a small part of us. Also, I think our thoughts are very influenced by our environments and our upbringings, and I think it's very dependent on our situation. So our thoughts can't be us if they're so easily influenced by outside sources. Even just something as small as getting to know yourself and just like learning how to quiet your mind, that is uncomfortable enough. If it feels like a challenge, that's a good enough step for you. And I think there's no step that's too small for people to be able to take.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it. There's no step too small because you just gain momentum from extending those steps bit by bit.
Yeah, and if you don't start with the small steps and you start with a big step and then don't do any more after that, there's no point. You're not going to progress. You're just going to do that one thing and then bounce straight back. Whereas if you start with the little tiny things that don't feel like much, eventually over time they'll become the big thing. And that's the goal.
Absolutely.
Being in a slump can sometimes feel isolating. What advice would you give to someone who does feel isolated or hesitant to reach out for help?
I think we're all made of the same stuff at the end of the day, and whatever you're going through, somebody else who you know has had a similar experience or will have a similar experience. I think we can feel like we're the only one going through whatever it is.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really common.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're really not. There is always somebody who's been through that, and actually opening up to the right person, whoever that is, knowing somebody that you can trust, and that might be part of your network or somebody professional. It's like we were saying before, you start to feel better just by talking about it.
Yeah.
We need different people for different reasons, I suppose. Sometimes we need people who are jolly, who are fun to be around. Sometimes we need that person who we can have quite an in-depth conversation with. And I think friendships are like that. You get different needs met from different friends.
Yeah. 100%, definitely. I think it's really important for people to realise that as well, because your support system doesn't mean all of your friends.
No.
Because I didn't realise that for a very long time. And also, just because somebody isn't in your support system, it doesn't mean they're not your friend.
Yeah.
They're just not that person for you. Slumps are a really good opportunity to grow and learn. How can we shift our perspective from seeing a slump as kind of a setback and like a pause in our life to seeing it as something to learn and grow from?
Just remembering that slumps are there to help us grow and reminding ourselves of that. And of course, slumps generally are really uncomfortable, but growth is uncomfortable at times.
Yeah.
I think generally growth can be very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, growth is change and change is uncomfortable.
Yeah, and we don't like uncertainty as human beings, do we? So it's kind of accepting that we're naturally going to shy away from that. But I think a good question to ask is, what am I learning from this? And it's not always possible to answer, but it's worth asking the question at various times. And also knowing, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but knowing that life is happening for you.
Yeah. Sometimes
we have a really difficult chapter and then we look back and think, well, if I hadn't have had that chapter, this wouldn't have happened and that wouldn't have happened. And I wouldn't have known how to deal with this situation that I'm now in. So they are difficult, but they are there for a reason. We are just going through what we need to go through. And at the end of that, we will grow. We'll have different parts of ourselves that we didn't have before. But it's tough. It is tough.
Yeah, definitely. I think also a really good thing to do in that is to show gratitude for your slumps.
Yeah, and that's great that you mentioned gratitude, because I haven't mentioned it and I should. Sometimes if I'm in a slump and I hear the monkey mind going, I will say to myself, I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful for that. And even if you start naming random things like your sofa.
Yeah.
But, there are some people who don't have a sofa because, in third world countries, they don't have things like running water, etc. So if we need something to be grateful about, we can put that hat on. I'm in a first world country and therefore I can be grateful for having an oven, or whatever, having a plentiful supply of food. And it does shift our mood. And I do use it now more than ever. So it's a tool as well as being a good thing to do. It's actually a useful tool for controlling your mood.
So for those of us who put too much pressure on ourselves or have unrealistically high expectations of ourselves, which I think is quite a lot of us these days, how can we set realistic expectations to avoid the burnout that often leads to the slumps?
Well, sometimes what I do with my clients is I draw a line with 0 and 100, so 0 at one end, 100 at the other, and I ask them, what would it be like if you set your expectations at 80% or 70% rather than 100%? And it might be that you just lower your expectations of yourself a little bit. That makes it easier, and again, it's about small steps, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think finding practical ways to ask yourself, well, do I need to do 100% on this activity? Could I just do 70 or 80%? What would be the impacts of that? And there'll be some things that you do want to do at 100%, and then there's others that you could definitely do at 70 or 80%. So it's kind of turning that dial down on perfectionism.
Yeah.
And sometimes perfectionism is just a kind of an automatic autopilot behaviour. We just give 100% to everything without really thinking about it. But if we ask, what are my priorities? What's going to happen if I don't do that? Then you learn to prioritise.
Kind of life-changing, actually, because I feel like I've always give 100% to everything. I really like that tool of writing it down and visualising it as well on a scale. I think if you just think it, your perfectionism mind is probably way easier for it to be like, oh no, you do need to do it like 100%. Whereas if you write it out, you can actually look at it and think, if I don't do that laundry, what's going to happen? Nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think these things are habitual. So it's breaking the habit of perfectionism, it's breaking the habit of people pleasing, and it's just being patient with yourself as well whilst you're doing it.
I think that's really important. I don't think enough of us give ourselves that patience, but I think that comes with the compassion. Once we learn to be compassionate, we can then learn to be patient.
That's it. And I think being impatient is a symptom of perfectionism.
Yeah, definitely. So we've covered quite a lot today and we've learned a lot of valuable lessons. If somebody listening was to take just one thing away from this episode and everything we've spoken about, what would you want that one thing to be?
It's a really good question. I think I would want them to know that whatever they're going through will pass, that they have a lot of power within themselves to navigate this period of their lives, and the mind often gets in the way. So learn to manage your mind and you're halfway there. You are a very powerful being and you have access to a lot of power to create a really good life. And often it's our mind that gets in the way. It's that little voice, the monkey mind, that critic, whatever it is, that gets in the way. So just learn to get to know your mind. Learn to know that it will tell you a whole load of rubbish at times. And then it becomes easier once you see it through that lens. This is just my mind talking. It's just that little voice of power.
Percy the parrot.
Yeah.
It's always chatting rubbish.
Absolutely, that's what they do.
Yeah. I love that. That's really good advice, I think.
Thank you.
For those listening who recognise they're in a slump right now, what is one small action that they can take today to start to climb their way out of that slump?
Talk to someone, write down your feelings, just start to express how you're feeling. Don't keep it in, let it out, and then start doing all the things that we've talked about. But just start the ball rolling. Break the pattern, do something different.
Are there any resources like books or websites or anything that you would recommend for listeners who want to learn more about overcoming and avoiding slumps and building up their resilience to them?
There are masses of resources. And once you start to tune into them, you can find heaps of them. But there are some good books. Maybe I could give you some links.
Yeah, that'd be good, and I'll leave them in the description.
Yeah, but I could link to a couple of videos, certainly some books, meditations, some breathing exercises. So that would get people going. And then of course, the nature of the digital world is that you will find more and more.
Yeah, and all the algorithms as well, what you're looking at, it will show you more of that as well.
Yeah. And then also, there's so many resources that it's about finding the stuff that works for you as an individual. It's a bit of a journey of exploration, but I can certainly provide some stuff to get started.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I think we've learned a lot of valuable lessons. I know I've definitely learned some tools that I'm going to be taking away and using.
Oh, great.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it. And I've really loved what you've had to say.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute joy.
So if you want to follow Claire on Instagram, what's your social medias, Claire?
It's Wheel of Life Coaching, both on Instagram and Facebook. I try and post some helpful tips because I see it as a place for teaching. So I try to cover some of the things that we've talked about today in more depth.
Definitely worth giving Claire a follow if you've enjoyed this episode, because she does post a lot of helpful advice, as you can tell from this entire episode, full of valuable advice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Squares and Circles. I hope today's conversation brought you valuable insights, inspiration, and tools to push through those tough moments in life. The transition from teenagehood to adulthood can be hard, but with the right mindset and support, you can absolutely thrive. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate, review, whatever it is on the platform you're listening to, as it helps us to reach other people who might find these conversations helpful. Also, make sure to catch us over on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Squares and Circles Pod to catch more daily doses of this helpful and valuable information. Also, don't forget to follow Claire, as she also posts helpful tips about mindfulness and overcoming life challenges, and I'll leave all of her links in the description. For more resources and journal prompts on today's topic, as always, you can head over to our website at squaresandcirclespod.com. And always remember, grow with purpose, dream delusionally, and become the person that you are destined to be. Catch you next time. Bye!